when James Brown pushed his half-eaten plate of meatloaf across the worn Formica table at Ruby's Diner in Macon, Georgia. He wasn't thinking about music or fame or the fact that his latest single had barely cracked the top 40 on the R&B charts. He was thinking about exhaustion, about 2 decades of fighting to stay relevant while disco took over and younger artists claimed his spotlight. The diner was nearly empty that October afternoon in 1974, nobody recognizing the man in the burgundy suit who'd revolutionized American music. If you believe that sometimes the moments that save us come from the most unexpected places, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happened in the back of Ruby's Diner that afternoon would remind one of music's greatest legends why he'd spent his entire life refusing to quit. And it would come from a 14-year-old boy who didn't even know he was about to change someone's life. Then he heard it. Rhythm, deliberate and unmistakable, coming from the kitchen. Someone was playing Cold Sweat, with variations James had never considered, turning his creation into something both familiar and completely new. James walked to the kitchen without asking permission, pushed through the swinging door, and found a skinny 14-year-old kid in a stained apron, using serving spoons as drumsticks on pots and pans arranged like a drum kit. The boy had his eyes closed, completely absorbed, his hands working the spoons with raw technique and pure feel. The pocket was there, that elusive quality that separated musicians who played notes from musicians who played soul. James was transported back to his own childhood, when music was survival and salvation. James stood watching as the boy worked through variations, experimenting with accents and fills. The boy's face showed concentration that couldn't be faked, the look of someone for whom music was necessity. James recognized that look because he'd seen it in his own reflection for decades. After several minutes, the boy opened his eyes and froze, fear flashing across his face. James raised one hand, calming, and spoke quietly. "Don't stop. Keep playing." James looked at him, seeing something he recognized because he'd lived it himself. "Your rhythm," James said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "It sounds like grief." The boy's face changed, surprise and pain flickering across his features, his carefully maintained composure cracking just slightly, enough for James to see that he'd touched something true, something the boy had been trying to hide or maybe didn't fully understand himself. The spoons trembled slightly in the boy's hands, and he looked down at the dirty dishes, at the pots and pans that had become his instruments. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet and uncertain, the voice of someone unused to being seen, really seen, by anyone. "My mom left when I was 5 or 6, sir. My dad played James Brown records to calm me down. Now I work here after school to help with bills, and when I'm washing dishes, I play the rhythms. Makes me feel less alone." James felt something break open in his chest. He'd built an empire trying to prove he was worth staying for. And here was a child who'd learned the same brutal lesson, who'd found in James Brown's rhythms the same salvation. "I know that feeling," James said, his voice rougher than he intended, emotion making it crack slightly in a way he usually kept carefully controlled. "I know exactly that feeling. My mother left when I was young too," James heard himself saying, words he rarely spoke aloud, history he kept locked away because successful people weren't supposed to still be wounded by childhood abandonment, weren't supposed to carry that weight decades later. Walked away one morning and never came back. No explanation. No goodbye. Just gone. And for years, for my whole life really, I've been trying to prove I was worth keeping. Everything I've done, every song I've written, every stage I've performed on, it's all been about proving that I matter, that I'm valuable, that I shouldn't have been left behind." The boy nodded slowly, recognition in his eyes, understanding passing between them that transcended age and fame and circumstance. Because abandonment speaks a universal language that anyone who's experienced it immediately recognizes. James gestured toward the pots and pans, toward the makeshift drum kit the boy had created from necessity and imagination. "You're playing my music, but you're making it your own. That variation you were doing, that accent pattern on what would be the snare, I never thought of that. You're taking what I created and pushing it somewhere new. That's what music is supposed to be. Not something dead that gets preserved in museums, but something alive that grows and changes and gets passed down, each person adding their own pain and joy and experience to it." For the first time since James had entered the kitchen, the boy smiled, a hesitant expression that transformed his face from wary to hopeful. And James felt something shift in his own chest, some weight lifting that he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. The record executives who'd told him his music was dated, who'd suggested he was finished, they didn't understand that music wasn't about being current. It was about being true, about finding rhythm in grief and joy in survival, and meaning in the simple act of making sound that connected one human being to another across whatever distance separated them. "What's your name?" James asked, though part of him already knew this moment was bigger than names, that this encounter would matter regardless of what they called each other. "Jamal, sir. Jamal Hayes." "Jamal, I'm James Brown." The boy's eyes went wide, his mouth opening slightly in shock as his brain processed the information, connecting the man sitting on a milk crate in Ruby's diner kitchen with the voice that came from his father's record player every night, with the legend whose rhythms he'd been trying to recreate on pots and pans. The spoons fell from his hands, clattering into the sink, and he took a step backward, as if proximity to James Brown required more space to process. As if fame had a physical presence that needed room to exist. You're really..." Jamal stammered, unable to complete the sentence, his face cycling through disbelief and excitement and fear that this might be some elaborate joke or dream. "I'm really," James confirmed with a slight smile, the first genuine smile he'd felt in weeks. "And you're really talented. That rhythm you were playing, that feeling you're putting into it, that can't be taught. That comes from life, from experience, from having something to say that needs to come out in sound. Don't lose that. Don't let anyone tell you that feeling doesn't matter, that technique is more important than soul. Because they're wrong. Technique serves soul, not the other way around." "Play it again," James said. Not as a command, but as a request. And Jamal picked up his spoons with hands that shook slightly from nervousness and excitement, positioning himself at the sink, taking a breath to center himself the way James had taught himself to do before every performance, before every moment when everything depended on being present and focused and in the pocket. Jamal started playing, building the rhythm gradually, and this time he was looser, more confident, less self-conscious about being watched, letting the music flow through him the way it was meant to flow, the way James himself had learned to let it flow when he stopped trying to control it and just let it be what it needed to be. James listened with his eyes closed. Really listened in a way he hadn't listened to music in months, maybe years. Letting Jamal's improvised performance wash over him and through him, feeling the rhythm in his chest and his bones, recognizing his own creation, transformed by someone else's experience and interpretation. This was why he'd started making music in the first place. Not for the charts or the fame or the money, though all of that had been necessary for survival. But for this connection, this moment when sound became bridge between two people who otherwise would never have found each other. When rhythm spoke truths that words couldn't articulate. When Jamal finished, letting the last beat fade into the ambient noise of the kitchen. James opened his eyes and found them wet with tears he hadn't authorized or anticipated. Emotion breaking through the walls he'd built over decades of performing and posturing and protecting himself from feeling too much. He'd come into this diner exhausted and defeated, convinced that his time had passed, that the music he'd created no longer mattered in a world that had moved on to disco and the early stirrings of what would become hip-hop. And this 14-year-old boy playing pots and pans in a kitchen had just reminded him that music doesn't die as long as someone keeps playing it, keeps transforming it, keeps finding in it whatever they need to survive. "Thank you," James said quietly. And Jamal looked confused, because legends weren't supposed to thank unknown kitchen workers. Success wasn't supposed to acknowledge struggle in that way. But James meant it with everything he had. Meant it in a way that transcended politeness or social convention. "You just reminded me why I do this. I needed that reminder today more than you can possibly know." The kitchen door swung open, and the waitress who'd served James his meatloaf stuck her head in, her tired face showing irritation at finding a customer in her kitchen, her mouth opening to deliver what was clearly going to be a sharp reprimand, until she recognized James. Really looked at him and processed who was sitting in her kitchen talking to her dishwasher. Her expression shifted from anger to confusion to something like awe, her voice catching slightly when she spoke. "Mr. Brown? Is everything okay? Is there a problem with your food?" James shook his head, standing up fully and brushing off his suit, returning to the persona he wore in public. The godfather of soul who commanded stages and demanded respect. Though something in him had fundamentally shifted in the last 15 minutes. Some weight had been redistributed in a way that made standing up straighter feel natural rather than forced. "No problem at all. Your dishwasher here is a remarkable musician. You should know that you have something special working in your kitchen." Jamal stood frozen by the sink, still holding his spoons, looking like he couldn't quite believe any of this was happening. That James Brown had not only heard him play, but had sat with him and shared his own story and called him talented. James pulled a napkin from the dispenser on the nearby prep counter and grabbed a pen from his jacket pocket. He wrote down a phone number in careful, deliberate strokes, then handed the napkin to Jamal, watching the boy take it with trembling hands, holding it like it might disintegrate if he gripped too hard or breathed too heavily. "That's my direct line. Not my manager, not my publicist, me. I want you to call me in 2 weeks, on a Saturday morning around 10. I'm going to be in Augusta, which is close to here, and I want you to come to my house. I want you to meet some people, musicians, who can teach you things about rhythm and technique that will take what you already have, this natural feel you've got, and give you the tools to do something with it. But more than that, I want to introduce you to my band, to the people who've been playing with me for years, because I think they need to hear what you're doing, how you're interpreting the music. I think you have something to teach us." Jamal's mouth opened, but no sound came out, his brain struggling to process an invitation that seemed impossible, that seemed like the kind of thing that happened in dreams or movies, but not in real life. Not to boys who washed dishes at Ruby's diner to help their fathers pay rent. "Is your father working today?" James asked. And Jamal shook his head, speaking carefully, as if afraid of saying the wrong thing and breaking whatever spell was currently operating in this kitchen. "My mom left. I live with my dad. Diane here, she's been real good to us. Gave me this job when we needed money bad. Lets me practice on the pots when it's slow." James looked at Diane, really looked at her, seeing past the tired waitress persona to recognize someone who'd chosen kindness when she didn't have to, who'd created space for a kid to find joy in a job that was supposed to be just labor. "You're a good person," Not many people make room for other people's dreams when they're just trying to survive themselves. Jamal is lucky to have you looking out for him. James pulled out his wallet and extracted several $20 bills, not as payment or charity, but as tangible acknowledgement, and handed them to Diane. For your kindness, and for letting me sit in your kitchen and remember why I fell in love with music in the first place. That's worth more than a meatloaf special. Then James turned back to Jamal. This boy, who looked so much like James himself, had looked at 14, all hunger and potential and fear that the world would crush him before he had a chance to become whatever he was meant to become. 2 weeks, Saturday, 10 in the morning, don't forget. And Jamal, whatever happens with music, whatever you end up doing with your life, remember that what you feel matters. The grief, the joy, the anger, the hope, all of it matters. Rhythm is just organized feeling. Never let anyone tell you that feeling isn't enough. Jamal nodded, clutching the napkin like a lifeline, and James could see the boy's mind already racing ahead to that Saturday morning, to possibilities that had seemed impossible just 30 minutes ago, to a future that had suddenly expanded beyond the confines of Ruby's diner kitchen. James walked toward the door, then paused and turned back one last time. And Jamal, keep playing on those pots and pans. Keep finding music in whatever's around you. That's what funk is. That's what I've been trying to teach people for 20 years. Music isn't something that exists in concert halls and recording studios. It exists everywhere, in everything, if you're willing to listen and create. You already know that. Don't forget it. 32 years later, on Christmas morning 2006, James Brown lay in a hospital bed in Atlanta, Georgia, his body finally giving out after 73 years of relentless motion, of refusing to stop or slow down, or admit that mortality applied to him the same way it applied to everyone else. Pneumonia had settled into his lungs, his heart was failing, and the doctors had stopped pretending that he was going to recover, instead managing his pain and trying to keep him comfortable in what everyone understood were his final hours. His children were there, his friends, members of his band who'd played with him for decades, all of them taking turns sitting beside his bed, holding his hand, sharing memories of a life that had been extraordinary by any measure, that had changed American music in ways that couldn't be quantified or contained. But in the quiet moments between visitors, when James drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind traveling through 7 decades of memories, he found himself returning again and again to that afternoon in Ruby's diner, to the kitchen where he'd heard a 14-year-old boy turn grief into rhythm, where he'd been reminded why music mattered, where he'd connected with someone whose pain mirrored his own across an impossible distance of age and experience. He'd gone on to record more albums, to tour more venues, to fight more battles with record executives and ex-wives and the IRS. But that moment in the kitchen had sustained him through all of it, had given him something to hold on to when the industry told him he was finished, when his body started breaking down, when success felt hollow and fame felt like a prison. Jamal Hayes had called that Saturday morning exactly 2 weeks later, had come to James's house in Augusta with his father, a quiet man who wept when he shook James's hand and thanked him for seeing something in his son. James had introduced Jamal to Clyde Stubblefield and Jabbo Starks, the drummers who defined funk rhythm, and had watched Jamal play for them on a real drum kit, had seen these master musicians recognize immediately what James had recognized in that kitchen, that this boy had something special, something that couldn't be taught because it came from lived experience transformed into sound. Jamal had never become famous, had never recorded hit albums or toured the world, but he'd become a music teacher at a high school in Macon, passing down what he'd learned to generations of students creating space for kids who needed music the way he'd needed it, the way James had needed it, offering them the same recognition and validation that James had offered him in Ruby's diner. James had stayed in touch with Jamal over the years, occasional phone calls and visits, a relationship that existed outside the machinery of show business, that reminded James that success wasn't measured in chart positions or album sales, but in connections made and lives touched and moments of recognition that changed trajectories. On his deathbed, James thought about Jamal and wondered if the boy, now a middle-aged man with students of his own, understood how much that kitchen encounter had meant, how much James had needed that reminder that music was bigger than ego or fame or commercial success, that it was fundamentally about transformation, about taking pain and turning it into something beautiful, about refusing to let abandonment and poverty and struggle have the final word. A nurse came in to check James's vitals, adjusting his IV and asking if he needed anything for pain. And James shook his head weakly, conserving his energy, thinking about rhythm and grief and the boy who'd played pots and pans like they were sacred instruments. James had spent his whole life trying to prove he was worth staying for, trying to show his mother and the world that he mattered, that he had value, that he shouldn't have been abandoned. But that afternoon in Ruby's diner, he'd finally understood that worth wasn't something you proved through achievement or fame or relentless work. Worth was inherent, was given rather than earned, was something you recognized in yourself when you saw it reflected in someone else's eyes. When someone who barely knew you chose to share their pain, because they sensed you'd understand, because grief recognized grief and rhythm recognized rhythm, and music became the language that connected everyone who'd ever needed saving. James Brown died on Christmas Day 2006, and the news coverage focused on his achievements, his innovations, his impact on American culture, the way he'd transformed music and influenced everyone from Mick Jagger to Michael Jackson to every hip-hop artist who'd ever sampled Funky Drummer. But for Jamal Hayes, watching the news in his living room in Macon with his own teenage son beside him, the real legacy was simpler and more profound. James Brown had walked into a kitchen where a 14-year-old dishwasher was playing pots and pans, and instead of ignoring him or dismissing him or treating him like part of the scenery, he'd sat down and listened. He'd recognized grief in rhythm, had shared his own grief in return, had created a moment of connection that proved music wasn't about performance or perfection, but about being human together, about acknowledging pain and finding beauty and refusing to let abandonment have the final word. If this story reminded you that greatness isn't about fame, but about the moments when we recognize each other's humanity, share this video. Because the world needs more stories about connection, about seeing people who society overlooks, about remembering that everyone carrying grief deserves to have that grief recognized and honored. That's what James Brown understood on Christmas Day 2006, in his final hours, thinking about a kitchen and a boy, and the rhythm that sounds like grief transformed into something worth keeping.